Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next in our continuing conversations between the Center for Palestine Studies at Columbia University and LIFTA volumes. This is, as some of you I'm sure are aware, this is the latest in a series of conversations we've been having together over this past semester, and we'll be continuing these conversations over the summer into the next semester. So keep your eyes peeled for details on that. Just to start with a couple of thank yous, we'd like to thank, when I say we, that's CPS and LIFTA, we'd like to thank the Society of Fellows and the Heyman Center for the Humanities at Columbia, and also the Center for Archaeology and the Columbia Global Center in Amman for their financial support. I'm going to pass over now to our friends and colleagues at LIFTA, but before I do so, if you have any questions, please put them in Q&A, and we will get to those after about 45 minutes or so. Okay, I'm going to pass over to Leila and Amira from LIFTA. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. My name is Leila Pinado, and I'm a co-programmer of Palestine in Between in collaboration with CPS and my colleagues Amira, Cher, and Lena Mansour. I'm happy to co-introduce this special live conversation, Nothing Old, Nothing New, produced by Bilna'Es with LIFTA and CPS. This conversation is an extension of a project by the same name by Haitham Ennasr, which features a collection of experimental video games, drawings, text, and objects developed over the course of 6 years. The project plays on the relationship between capitalism, colonialism, depictions of landscapes, real estate development, and folklore. Haitham will be in conversation with Freya Dutta, Elias, Wakeem, and moderator Ruanne, Abou-Rahme, discussing how the practices correlate and intersect revolutionary cultural practices at large.
Hi, my name is Asad, and it's my pleasure to introduce the panelists. We have Ruanne Abou-Rahme, who is moderating, and she's an artist and the co-founder of Bilna'Es. She works across a range of sound, image, text, installation, and performance practices. We also have Haitham Ennasr, who is an artist and interactive designer who creates through drawings, painting, sculpture, video games, text, and performance. We also have speaking Elias Wakeem, who is a genderqueer artist and activist who makes art that bends and plays with language, character, and identity. They also perform and give lectures on drag culture and queer identity in Palestine. And we have Freya Dutta, who is an artist, designer, and educator who uses interactive storytelling to challenge systems of power. Thank you for joining us and supporting the program, and you can find out more about what we have coming up next at PalestineInBetween.com. And I will now pass it on to our moderator, Ruanne. Thank you.
Hello, thank you so much for LIFTA, love LIFTA, and for CPS. I'm so happy to be collaborating with you all, and also thank you so much to the artists who are all really incredible. Just to speak a little bit about Bilna'Es before getting into Haytham's project. Bilna'Es is basically a sort of a disciplinary publishing project that was started in 2020 that publishes everything from music to online games to eventually text performances. So it's really thinking about publishing in the most sort of like expanded sense. We started it, a group of us, mainly me and Bassem Abbas and Muqata, who's a musician. And it really came from a sense or maybe like more of a need to really understand how artists can be supporting each other in this period, and especially how in Palestine, Palestinian artists can be really, giving space to work that usually don't get the space that they deserve. The first project that we started with was an electronic music album by the musician Dakin. It's an amazing album, so if you get a chance to go check it out on Bilna'Es later on, please do. We also have a bunch of other music releases that are going to come out this year. And for now, today, we're talking about Haitham Ennasr's incredible project, which is not out yet, but will be out next week. So please make sure, and we will make sure that you try to check back in to actually experience it. And Haitham is an artist that I, met in New York. And as soon as I experienced his work, I totally fell in love with it. And so it's an amazing pleasure for me to be able to collaborate with him in this way and to also adapt this, this work of his for Bilna'Es. So just a little bit get into it before giving him the space to talk about it. It's a project that he's been working on for the last 6 years. I actually first saw it in an exhibition in New York. And it's been growing, so it has 3 parts. And as Lena mentioned, it involves experimental video games and drawings drawings that are also sometimes done on bread, sometimes done on bed sheets, sometimes done on tissues. But it was also a VR experience. Text, it has all these kind of performative elements. And so as soon as I saw it, I fell in love with it. We in Bilna'Es felt that it would be amazing to actually adapt that work into a desktop and mobile experience and really open it up for different ways of kind of viewing and different kind of circuits of distribution. And so I'm very excited that's actually happening. And I guess to start off, what I wanted to discuss with you, Haitham, is something that really drew me to your work was the way in which your projects create sort of worlds or spaces for us to inhabit that are in a sort of space-time that is not within sort of colonial capitalist capture. So in a way, it is a space in which we can try to escape that capture and get out of it. And the other thing that I really was drawn to was sort of this idea of kind of radical softness that is in the work, the idea of play, how you're playing with things whilst dealing with, situations and materials that are very heavy, very traumatic, very violent at times. So maybe just to open up, if you could talk about that in relation to this epic 3-part project, Nothing Old, Nothing New. I'll hand it over to you from here.
Sweet. Thank you, Ruanne, and thank you everyone who was involved in putting this together. I'm actually gonna start answering your question by sharing my screen. Through that process, I'm gonna talk a little bit about my practice, but also talk a bit about the practice of some of the other artists who are here with us today and how Freya and Elias have also influenced my practice and even some of your work as well. So as Ruanne mentioned, Nothing Old, Nothing New is a series of projects and drawings and texts and objects that I've been working on for a number of years now. And also, as she mentioned, the work that I create inhabits has kind of a sci-fi element to it. And that's, I think, where the idea of a future or a world that isn't necessarily tethered to different systems of oppression that we I take for granted comes in. And I think that's one of the powerful things that sci-fi has to offer. And also one of the powerful things that a digital medium or video games have to offer is that they enable you to navigate through a space. And once you are within that space, your perception of the world is kind of warped to that space that you are inhabiting digitally. So this is kind of a still from the last and third project that I did, Tabula Rasa. Another thing that my practice kind of involves is a sense of a dreamy, almost sense, the ability, I think it's really important to be able to at least to dream of a world that you would like to realize, or to dream of and envision those kinds of worlds. And so, and an element of playfulness. I think play is a very effective way to interact with things that are really traumatic, that are really powerful, and a way to almost, it opens a door for you to be able to reappropriate it and flip it on its head and use it against itself. And another thing that I use is also text. So a layering of play, the text kind of anchors these digital experiences and play, and kind of gives it a bit of a direction, and it gives it kind of a tooth to be able to bite with, but it's still kind of within that soft, dreamy space. And again, Ruanne mentioned that I draw on a lot of things, and I reappropriate a lot of objects. Sometimes it's a question of texture, sometimes it's a question of taking over something and imbuing it with power. So for example, this is from the first project called City and Scenes, and what this was is basically I was part of a fellowship program in Beirut, and we did a tour of downtown Beirut. And in that tour, we were given these reports, these annual reports of the Real Estate Development Agency that developed downtown Beirut, and there were more buildings that were destroyed in the redevelopment process than there was in the actual 20 years of civil war. And a lot of my work, as Ruanne mentioned, deals with ideas of the intersection between settler colonialism and real estate and capitalism. And so this is an image of the chairman that was covered with these almost talismanic objects that allowed for different forms and shapes to break out of that report and start creating these new worlds that you can inhabit, that reappropriate, I think, the very image of a chairman sitting and delivering an annual report. There's also a question of texture and softness. I feel like there's a lot of my work includes depictions of landscapes. Landscapes, they operate on two different ends. One end is this, it gives you this idea of a horizon, idea of something that you can, a world that you can aspire to live in. Idea like a utopia of some sort, but they also have been used quite heavily within colonial art to depict, like, you know, a fertile land that the colonizers can then go to and inhabit. Whether it's Palestine or South America, you know, there's always been these depictions of landscapes that are essentially inviting a settling and a colonization of the land. And so there's kind of a lot of my landscapes are like, are on fragile material. Even if they're not on fragile material, they don't necessarily, they seem a little ethereal and dreamy. And the last thing that I want to mention is this idea of ritual and this idea of talismanic objects. And again, like we see these are, for example, seashells that do have landscapes, but that also have almost a talismanic element to them. And this is where I'm gonna maybe interlude slowly. Some of these seashells were collected with Freya. We did our own ritual on the beach, and she created her own also set of talismans and rituals. But there is still like this fragility and softness to it, and there are still also references to sci-fi and space. I would perhaps describe this as sci-fi folk, you know, where there is this element of sci-fi, element of folklore, talisman, and magic, and elements of reappropriating all of that and using it with the purpose of imagining a revolutionary utopia. And so I'm gonna kind of take it a little further and move to Freya Dutta's work. And I'm just gonna do a quick intro about how Freya's work influenced my work, and how our friendship over many years have informed some of my practice and some of this project in particular. And I'll also do the same with Elias after Freya. So Freya and I both went to design school together, and Freya's work, the conversations that we've had, and our work started within the context of the colonial and the post-colonial, and then through the years it expanded to include labor and class, as well as and the struggle against capitalism as the flip side of the struggle against colonialism. And so these are some of Mohini's more kind of didactic call to action work. The left is the logo and a poster for the United Delivery Worker, and the right is part of a pamphlet that was given around for a demonstration for a march that happened in New York for the workers. And there's also, in addition to action, there's the layering of text and images and describing something that happened, and either historically or currently, and using art and advertisement also to kind of create a call to arms of some sort. And there's also an element of science fiction to Mohini's work. For example, this is a comic about Shell creating mushrooms to get rid of oil as part of a PR campaign stunt, while they are like kind of fighting water defenders, and then the mushrooms themselves kind of getting out of control and eating the Shell executives and turning the Shell executives themselves into mushrooms and spirits that inhabit the waters. So both sci-fi and folklore as well are parts of Mohini's practice and have influenced me, and I think it went both ways. And so, yeah, I'm gonna, and even some of her paintings and drawings and silent comics also have that kind of really strong, I also want to call it sci-fi folk theme. So yeah, Mohini, if you want to talk a little bit more about your practice and your work.
Sure, thank you, Haitham. It's so interesting to see the connections growing over the years since you and I both met on our first day of grad school. I think the common theme in both of our work is this idea of retooling or reusing something that's maybe almost corrupt or seen as a sort of toxic element or has these sort of toxic impacts on society. Like a lot of science fiction culture can be seen as really toxic, or like play culture can be seen as toxic, but reusing it to support and create these like speculative folk narratives or folk terrains. And I feel like I do that with using the language of advertising and capitalism a lot, like in comic books, in my games, and sort of trying to subvert it to sort of make fun of the sort of hegemonic strength these concepts have. In a way, I feel I never really had access to critical thinking until really later on in life, like education wise. Like I kind of had a very pragmatic education early on. So I think I've always tried to use critical thinking, but break it down in a way advertising might. So it's like more accessible to people. So yeah, at this current time, I feel like I was a bit exhausted in the pandemic and trying to find something meaningful to do. So I've just been making art in support of folks who I like and people whose struggles I support, whose struggles I share. So that's where I am. And it's great to sort of see how well our work connects.
And it's interesting you mentioned retooling, because that's something that capitalism does a lot, right? It takes things that used to be revolutionary and co-opts them into another tool in the arsenal of capitalism. And so capitalism's ability to absorb everything that's coming directly against it and repurpose it as part. And I think that that's something that a lot more artists are trying to do now, is to repurpose capitalism itself and kind of flip the mirror to an extent. And yeah, I think that it's interesting that you are working within the context of another thing that people don't know about Mohini, probably from this presentation, is she's also a game designer, and we both met through games and through play. And she was an active part of unionizing
Game developers.
Game developers as well. And also, I feel like this there's like an interesting balance between movement art and also art that is not just in the immediate and that's kind of looking towards the future as well.
It's sort of like trying to parse what the narrative of our like revolution is, right? Like as we are in it, but like awkwardly trying to use whatever tools we can to sort of make it. And I feel like I see that in your work too, like trying to bridge these cultures, these conversations, these media landscapes with an expression that's almost an emotion, like in visual form. And I feel like that's just how things have been shaping up, right? Like our struggles are changing too.
That's true. And so I would like to talk also about another artist who has influenced my work. Elias and I were roommates, and we lived with each other for a while in New York. And what struck me about Elias's practice is his position, the positioning of themselves within their practice. They always center themselves as a non-binary and as a queer body occupying a space. And for example, this work, Aqida, there's this tension that you often find in Elias's work, a physical tension of being waxed as part of a live performance, a tension when you play with words, Aqida meaning to sugar your hair off, and also meaning to have an ideology, an attention between societal gender norms and and the body that they are inhabiting and that they're trying to assert and almost reappropriate. Another work of theirs, for example, is the series of photographs, Quality Assurance, where they are also centering, there's a level of intimacy in their work, like whether it's this one and the intimacy of their own body, or these photographs of Quality Assurance, the intimacy, first of all, the intimacy that they have with their subjects being their friends and their lovers, and also the act of queering bodies that were not perceived as queer before, and also the intimacy of putting you into themselves in their personal life. So this was a photo that Elias took of me and took of themselves back when we were living together in New York. And for example, it's also a capture of this garment that I'm wearing, which is a reappropriation, like it's a reappropriated garment. It was my graduation gown that I then covered in almost these talismanic dots as well, and was wearing it. That was kind of the beginning of the process of me covering things and markings and animating them to an extent. And again, because of Elias's practice and our interaction with this other, starting to center myself within my projects and starting to center my body within these projects. And also, I feel in Elias's work, there is an element of reappropriation and claiming. For example, this is a work in which they are just present in two cities as visibly queer people. And not only that, but it's next to a monument, and they're placing themselves next to that monument as a form of not just existing, but owning and claiming a space. And so I'm gonna take it to Elias and see if you would like to talk a little bit more about your practice, about any of these projects or anything in general.
Hello. First of all, thank you for having me, Haitham, and you all. I'm very happy to be part of this panel. You've said a lot already about of the things of the work that you're doing, Haitham, and I'm not very familiar with Freya's work, but now you know, we're talking about the different the variety of the different things that we're actually that art practice is in. So I'm gonna just give you all a very brief introduction of the kind of art that I do. So technically, I do a lot of work, obviously, with my body. The whole idea, behind what is a body, how do we give a body an identity? How do we call it? When can we basically, let's say, stretch the edge of the body, whether with hearting it or with healing it? And the whole idea of gender and deconstructing gender in a patriarchal society, what does that say about us? What does that say about me? Not just as a human being, but as a person who has a story, who still lives under occupation / colonization that has been going for a long time. Can that be, regardless to the layers of hardships that my work has, can that be also playful? Can we actually discuss that and still enjoy it? I ask the questions whether art is basically just there for us to watch, or is it there to do something? Those are the different questions that I basically try to play or try to go around in my work. Yeah, that's that.
I think maybe Haitham, do you have something, or I was going to jump in?
Go jump in, please.
I mean, basically, Elias, I know your work, and I know its connection to Haitham and Freya. I just got introduced to your work recently, and I think it's incredible. What I find really interesting is the way in which there is this need for a different aesthetic and political language and imaginary expressed in all your practices in various different ways, but I think there are intersections. But I'm perhaps less interested in the intersections, but more interested in where does that need come from? And what does it mean to forge a political language or an aesthetic language within a landscape of essentially an incomplete, or at times we can even think failed revolution that in a way is also expressing a kind of incomplete language? And I know from myself, from my own practice, having tried to also create a different path, a different language, there's also sometimes a lot of resistance to that. So I think my question is twofold. Like, where does that urge come from? How does it perhaps express itself? And have you experienced sort of pushback against the ways in which you are trying to think and make work about difficult issues, right? So
Right.
yeah. So I don't know who wants to jump in first, but I'd love to hear from each of you.
I can go ahead and jump in first. I think there's always a question of legitimacy, right? Of, oh, well, are you actually revolutionary if you're trying to, you know, address it with a bunch of drawings on bread and seashells, right? Like, are you, and as queer Palestinians, right, like we're always put in a position where we have to either defend or justify our existence as both queer and Palestinian because of a lot of different historical and cultural practices, and also the Mossad's targeting of queer Palestinians specifically as a way to blackmail them into working for them. Like there's a lot of things to unpack, but I feel like there is a need for a multitude of languages, because I feel like one language hasn't worked and isn't enough, and a multitude of practices that are all working together towards that common goal. And I think that's where being intersectional is really important, right? Is that finding solidarity with other causes, with other struggles, with other revolutions, and realizing that there is strength in that solidarity, and that solidarity requires work and doesn't come naturally, but you know, the BDS campaign, the Queer Liberation Campaign, Black Lives Matter, water defending and anti-pipeline work. These are all struggles that have formed explicit ties of solidarity with one another, and that have grown stronger because of that. And so artistic and cultural production needs to reflect that, and needs to be able to showcase those relationships and that kind of solidarity, because they're all working towards emancipation, towards a better future in which these systems of oppression are no longer there.
It's very interesting what you're saying, Haitham. I'm going to comment on that. When we talk about being, you know, choosing your own identities, or being born into an identity, whether it's a Palestinian or a queer. I find a lot of the resistance and a lot of the struggle, for example, nowadays, not just, and throughout the years, not just by saying that I'm a queer, even though it is easier for me, but I don't know, maybe because I live inside occupied Palestine / Israel. When I say I'm a Palestinian, then I have a way much bigger struggle, right? So seeing I'm a queer inside my community or my society, it's already raising questions. But when I say where I live that I'm a Palestinian, I'm actually sometimes afraid to say that, right? So that I really ask myself, so the struggles kind of like, top each other. And with the art that we do, or with the cultural associations, when I'm trying to find the place to raise my voice or to say something, there is so much more, there's so much more, not just struggle, but also difficulties. Do I want to show my art inside any place that wanna just, give me a platform? What does that say about me as a queer or as a Palestinian? Is it even possible? What about BDS? What about the fact that if I don't perform in Israeli spaces, then I don't have my own, I don't have spaces, or I can't show my queer art inside Palestinian places, or not all of it. But so I asked myself, so where do we do the art then? Is it even possible? Do we give up on that? So those are just questions that like came up to my mind.
Yeah, I feel like there are a lot. I mean, that's why it's called a struggle, right? Because you have to actually, it doesn't come easy, especially if you're trying to be intersectional and work with different causes. I feel like we are part of a generation of artists who are doing amazing things, even regardless of all the different pressures, whether it's, managing your kind of ethics with the necessity of feeding yourself and bringing in income, whether it's, a number of other issues. There's always a way to navigate between, to navigate those spaces. And I think it makes sense to do it together, kind of collectively. And I'm curious to hear what Mohini thinks about all of that as well.
Yeah, I mean, the positions both you and Elias took are really interesting, and speak to me about why we have such interesting conversations, Haitham, because we come from slightly different positions of marginalized identity, right? Like, I guess my crisis is with the fact that being Indian is a crushing weight of history. Like, it's like an identity that wants to consume you, and it's just exhausting. Like, I feel like I struggle less with where I come from and more with, will it ever let me go and go somewhere else? And I think this is something a lot of artists and activists in India are facing too, with like the government crackdown on expression, on like really mundane forms of expression. Like signing a Google form can get you thrown in jail. And it's just like, there's just no perspective about the sort of backlash in India right now. Like, I don't even feel like I'm at risk. I mean, it could be anything. It could be relatives, a friend, someone you knew in school. And it's just getting worse and worse. I mean, as the situation in India is getting worse, like crackdown on expression on social media is also increasing. I feel like for me, I grew up in the 90s in the sort of fading, dying embers of like radical revolution in India. And it was, as you said, an incomplete revolution. Like, it hasn't completely lost itself, but it definitely was a very nihilistic time where no one believed in it and no one believed that it could do anything. And I kind of grew up with that sort of lack of faith in revolution. So I feel like my work has been reclaiming that and like reshaping that for a future I can see for the world. So it's shaped by the climate crisis. It's shaped by intersectional, intercultural, intergenerational conversation with folks like y'all, right? And it's also just shaped by my own like confusion with who I am, right? Like, and how that's not one thing. So I feel like that's why I make what I make, because it's just too hard to like hold it in. So like you have to like express it and like hope it doesn't do bad.
Yeah, and it comes to that very basic concept that we're stronger together, right? Like it's a union of causes, if you may, right? Of different people. It's you start organizing in small cells. You start helping each other monetarily, non-monetarily, materially, non-materially. You pool your resources and your strength, and you move forward, because again, like the oldest colonial trope is divide and conquer, right? Like it was true 200 years ago, and it's true today in its newer forms. And I think it's, yeah, realizing that
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I feel like for me, class consciousness or an awareness of class was really the unifying factor for like a deeper practice, right? Like we all share like classism, and like it goes from the climate crisis to capitalism to like anything. And I think the creative potential of labor, as random as that sounds, was really something that like lit a fire for me, because it just changed how you see relationships, like with people, with like your job, with your boss, you know, with your neighbor. Like it shapes everything. And I feel like what you're saying is totally true. It is that simple thing. We are stronger together, right? But it's so hard to believe it and like trust in it.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that I'm thinking about is sort of, you know, how many of us are operating within a kind of landscape of lack, right? So that's sort of also the concept of Bilna'Es, which is, it means in the negative. So what does it mean to operate actually in that negative zone, but from that negative zone, be able to generate different possibilities, right? Because we are living, you know, extremely difficult times in terms of racialized capitalism, racial oppression, settler colonialism on like a huge rampage, a man-made ecological crisis that is literally like destroying all kinds of forms of non-human life. So within this actually, and especially I think within, I could speak more directly within a Palestinian context, for example, there is almost like this kind of lack of resources that we're working from. There's a lack of support even, let's say. So I'm interested in how you're dealing with that lack of support, and to what extent I sort of feel in each of your practices, there is this kind of thread of activism. I think with Freya, with you, it's quite direct from what I saw with Antidote and different things that you're doing. But, you know, with Elias and Haitham, it's sort of more obscure, but I'm really, I'd really love to talk about how your work is a form of activism that is perhaps pushing up against the more sort of conventional ideas of what is activism, right? So if you could just kind of speak a little bit about that, I'd love it. Whoever wants to jump in first.
Well, I'm gonna go ahead. One of my mottos at this point that I've actually, you know, I remind myself with it each and every time is that existence is resistance, right? Now, asking the question is that what is resistance, right? So one of the main themes that I work and I interpret in my work and talk about and try to kind of express is what is gender. What is a man, what is a woman, what is a non-binary, how can I actually play with all of those genders? And, you know, the second you even try, you know, to try to not to say that there's, you know, there's no, you're not a woman or a man, you know, something, it's called resistance, or at least I call it resistance, you know. People are like, what? Like, you know, but there's men and women, right? But then you tell them, but you know, do you know that there's also intersection, people who are intersex, for example, and people don't know what it is. A lot of people, let's say, don't know what is that, even though that's not even, that's sex, that's not even gender. So this whole idea of kind of deconstructing gender, or deconstructing any idea in a heteronormative society, when we're talking about subjects that are taboo, it is a resistance. I'm not gonna lie to you, some days I wake up, I'm so energized with this idea of like resistance, and some other days I just don't want to leave bed, right? Some other days I just want to watch TED, you know, self-supporting videos, just to get myself the idea and to remind myself that this is not a struggle that has an end. It's just really asking again and again, what is the resistance? What am I resisting, and how to take it, how to not resist also, and how to surrender sometimes, right? Because we cannot just keep resisting all the time. But this is my take on this.
I can go next if Haitham, if you don't.
Please go.
Okay. I think I always have felt uncomfortable with the title of activist, although I think a lot of my work fits into that. I think putting myself in someone else's like struggle outside of like solidarity has always felt weird to me, but I understand what you're saying. Like, I think our struggles are interlinked is really how I see it. And I feel like I don't need to be in it to support it. So that's my own personal anxiety with the term. But I feel like over the years, the theme in my work has been to be joyful in the face of struggle, because I worked with climate change for many, many years with marginalized communities around Asia. And that shit is doom and gloom, man. Like, it's just like so depressing. Like, no one has any hope left. And it's just like, why would anyone want to do anything? And that's how I felt about it. And I think I used play at the time to sort of alleviate that and kind of help people spend time with the uncomfortable, like, truth, honestly, and like just like get like figure out what to do with it. And I guess for me, showing people that there is still some agency that they have in the face of like really bad things has been like the way forward, because I think that's how I feel like there's some way to move ahead. Like, it doesn't mean like there's a win state or something. It just means we can move ahead. We can move ahead a little bit more. We can move ahead together. We'll figure it out. And I guess that's how I have approached it. Like, even the very sort of didactic activist work right now in support of like labor unions and stuff, I try and use like a lot of themes and styles from comic books, which make it silly and funny, but like also we get to talk about like critical race theory in a way that's accessible to people sometimes, you know. And I guess that's just how I've distilled it through like years of working for like corporate advertising and like all of these really toxic spaces, and just like using some of their tools, you know, not for them, because they keep doing it. Like what you said, Haitham, like they keep taking from like radical, like radical like alternatives and like subsuming it into the like monster of like late stage capitalism, right? But like, what if we just did it again? Like, I don't think it's a goal or it's a solution to our problems, but it's a way to take back a little bit. And I guess iterating constantly and building the next stepping stone is how I see my work. So it doesn't really have a fixed form. It keeps changing.
Nice. For me, I think there's a lot of what both Freya and Elias said. There is the idea of deconstructing and pointing out, deconstructing different structures of oppression, whether it's gender and patriarchy, whether it's settler colonialism, whether it's capitalism. I mean, trying to take that apart and be playful with it a little bit as a way to break it down and be able to even address it or touch it. And there is an element of reappropriation, of taking something and ingesting it and pointing it back towards those structures. And for me, I'd like to do it in a way in which you are still able to dream. I think it's very important to be able to at least envision or dream what a world looks like. Because if you can't dream, why are you a revolutionary? And so I focus on that aspect of dreaming of something else, of being able to at least envision it. And also, like, the term like radical softness has been around in online queer spaces for a few years now, and it's something that I've been slowly adapting into my work. And I think that I'm really fascinated by this idea of a soft revolution, and of a deconstructuring and showing what is wrong, but of also dreaming and showing, not necessarily exactly detailing what the utopia looks like, but communicating that feeling of utopia and of being soft. And I try to do that with textures. I try to do that with the drawings that I do, and I try to do that with these kind of immaterial digital spaces that I create.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, that was like sort of the starting point of what I was talking to you about in the beginning. I was wondering if there's any questions, but doesn't seem, but if anyone does have a question now for the last 5 minutes, please do send it in. But yeah, that I think that idea of play and radical softness, which in a way is very taboo. You know, I have had experiences with my own work where people have, you know, especially people of a certain generation, I would say, have reacted very badly. Have almost felt that I am creating work that is too full of a certain vitality about topics that are very traumatic and have in the past just been dealt with in a more sort of, let's say, melancholic or kind of painful register. And for me, what's interesting is the way in which people themselves are not just trying to survive what we are going through. So you know, what I draw sort of strength from is, you know, just everyday practices, for example, in Palestine, where people, it's not just a question of survival. It's also a question of creating space. It's a question of joy, like you said. How can you create a space for joy? How can you create a space to imagine a different potential within the context of such a brutal settler colonial regime that is literally like sucking the air out, right? And that is what really gives me strength, and I continue to draw from. So it's not just a question of survival, and then within that, people are expressing desire, right? There's expressions of desire. There's expressions of the need almost to get out of yourself sometimes. So I think it's, for me, very much connected to people's practices, and like I locate it there, and then it ends up in my work, you know. And sort of the question about activism was a little bit provocative because I don't see myself as an activist at all in that way. but I'm more and more interested in what is the space that we together can create for a different sort of imaginary, right? That is drawing from people's practices very often, you know. And I don't know if anyone wants to kind of reflect on that. We're kind of running out of time, so any closing sort of like remarks or ideas or
yeah, I would say, just because you referenced your work, that's one of the things that I really appreciate the most about your work, actually, is that there is a lot of, it's a heavy archive with a lot of details of things that are extremely traumatic, but there is still that sense of revolutionary joy and hopefulness that's persistent in all of your work. You know, you talk about the masks that were stolen, but you also talk about the people who are having weddings in the destroyed villages, right? Like there's that reappropriate, and then you 3D print the masks themselves, right? Like there is that sense of reappropriation again. There is that deconstructing and dismantling the trauma and the oppression that already has happened. And there is that element of looking towards a brighter future, towards emancipation, towards a world that we can start dreaming about and work towards fulfilling and creating.
Absolutely, we need to claim it.
Yeah.
In all the small ways that we can.
And eventually big ways.
Eventually big ways, accumulatively.
Inshallah.
You
I want to
know.
reflect on that.
Oh,
I want
sorry.
to reflect on go ahead, Freya.
Oh, I just wanted to add that in my experience, it's been very similar to what you mentioned, Ruanne, where there's this sort of like weird sort of like tonality you have to fit in with when speaking about certain issues. For me, it was a really revolutionary moment when I started working with the Worker Justice Project, and they're like a worker-run labor group, and their approach to left politics is so joyful and so full of life and vitality. It's unlike anything that like NGOs or academics have, and it's like really making me question, you know, some of these like tonal things. Like the people kind of want to have fun.
Yes, we need to.
I'm gonna reflect on that with the whole idea of like it was a question that always rose whether I do as an activism. You know, I live in Palestine. I live under occupation. Like whatever I do, I feel like it's gonna say something and it's gonna provoke people. Is that an active? Like, am I supposed to call myself an activist? And I actually started using the word artivist, which is basically like, you know, like being a little bit, you know, artistic but activistic. Trying to find the joy at the end of the day. You know, there's so much injustice that we're seeing in the world, where the internet rise, and the social media has been giving us this, you know, possibility to actually share and talk and not be afraid of who we are and express those hardships. And finding the joy is a very interesting and challenging question, I have to say, that I've been facing. How can we talk about, like, you know, women's rights or killing women in the society where and that can that be joyful? It's not, like, you know what I'm saying. So I definitely relate to what you're saying.
I think we can wrap it up there unless anyone has something else they want to add. Haitham, you have something burning to say before we end?
No, I think
I want to say that, please, I mean, thank you so much to LIFTA and to CPS and to Elias, Haitham, and Freya. It's been really wonderful. And Haytham's project will be out next week. It's going to be incredible.
Yay.
So please check back on Bilna'Es on Instagram about that. And
anyone who's looking at this works at Google, can you please approve the project?
We're still trying to get the apps approved. It's another very, let's not get into the politics of that. But absolutely, that's a big issue, trying to get our app approved by these corporations that decide what can be experienced on the phone. But anyway, that's a good point to leave it at. Thank you so much, and lots of love to everyone.
Thank you all. And thank you for CPS and LIFTA and everyone who was involved. This was wonderful.
Thank you
for having us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was a joy.
Absolutely.
It was electric. Thank you so much.
Thank you.